you back. And for any newcomers, we're excited to have you with us today. 10 seasons, that's 1-0. We've been bringing valuable conversations as well as insights to the table through your Brain at Work digital community, from podcast recordings to the live show, which we kicked off in 2020. So we're thrilled to continue evolving as we deep dive more into this 10th season. So today's discussion centers around reimagining leadership, where we'll discover how the latest insights from neuroscience can actually revolutionize your approach to leadership, giving you the edge you need to excel in any field. And as I quickly share some housekeeping notes, would love if you could just drop in the chat, the comments box on the social here, and just let us know where you're joining us from today. It's always great to kind of see all the areas domestically as well as potentially globally where folks are dialing in from. In terms of technology, we are recording today's session. So if you're interested in the replay, just be on the lookout for an email later today. This email will also include a survey for feedback. Those of you who have worked with Neuro Leadership Institute before know we are real big on feedback. And there's also going to be a number of resources that are aligned to the content of today's conversation. We're also continuing with our research corner polling experience at the end. So please do make sure you stick around there. We do suggest, if possible, you put your phone on Do Not Disturb and quit out of your email and or messaging apps. We want you to get the most out of today's discussion. And what we say here is multitasking is the enemy of engagement. We love interaction and we want to see you sharing your insights and thoughts. So please do contribute those in the chat. I see everyone's welcoming in from all different places across the states and globe. But now here to get the show underway, I'm going to introduce our speakers of the day. Our first guest for today's discussion is an Aussie turned New Yorker. He coined the term neuroleadership, when he co-founded NLI over 2 decades ago. With a professional doctorate, 4 successful books under his name, a multitude of bylines ranging from HBR to New York Times, Wall Street Journal, many, many more. A very warm welcome for our co-founder, as well as the CEO of the Neuro Leadership Institute, Dr. David Rock. David, great to have you here today.
Thanks so much, Drew. And great to have you in front for a change. I know you've been behind the scenes for a long time, helping our partners really build habits, something I know you're passionate about. You run and lead the whole customer experience work for us. How long has it been now? Is it 8 years, right?
8.5 years, actually.
Wow, that's 100 years in
yeah.
Probably. Thanks for everything you do with us, and I really appreciate your partnership. Thanks very much for being here, Drew.
Absolutely, and just glad to be part of the discussion today. And I'd like to take this time to introduce our host for today's session. 20 years of organizational transformation, culture change, as well as leadership consulting experience. His work spans across the globe, working with CEOs, senior leaders from organizations such as Aerospace, the Federal Government of Canada, Royal Bank of Canada, T-Mobile, World Bank, as well as Microsoft. He's a lecturer at Simon Fraser University, where he teaches the neurosciences of business management to fifth-year business students. Coming to us live from lovely Vancouver, British Columbia, he is our global head of culture and leadership at NLI, Matt Summers.
Hey, Drew, thanks so much for having us, and great to be here. And David, great to be with you in such a rich conversation as we talk about this important conversation about reimagining leadership. Thanks for having us. Drew, why don't we dig in? David, would love to get us started as our listeners are, I'm sure, anticipating some rich dialogue around what we're doing at Neuro Leadership Institute and how we're partnering in meaningful ways with our clients around looking at how we reimagine leadership, not only in the current state, but also for the future. David, let's level set and set some groundwork for our conversation today. David, I know that you've been on the road for a lot of months now, globally, speaking to CHROs, CEOs, specifically in this context of leadership. Why don't we dig in and really talk about this notion of what the conversations you're having and what you're hearing from these CHROs and CEOs as we talk about this act of leading people versus leadership development. Why don't we start there and what you're seeing in the market?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a blessing and a curse being out on the road again. And one of the upsides is just getting a lot of really quality time with with CEOs. I think I've met with maybe 60 CEOs and spent like half a day with them in many different events recently. And the CHROs, like a similar number in different ways. So it's been really amazing. And you just, when you listen, when you spend quality time with that many people, you really start to see the trends and hear what's happening. And I think, there's a bunch of things, leaders are just really at a bit of a loss about what to do right now, would be sort of the summary. Like there's such a high level of burnout and disengagement and disenfranchisement, that in employees, not everyone, but it's just higher than it's ever been. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty around that. I think so the flip side of that is leaders need to be much better at like creating clarity. When in a difficult time. It's interesting. I was talking with a leader this week, and it's saying, if you come from like the medical field, for example, it almost feels irresponsible to do anything but present the facts, right? It feels like you're making things up, you're being irresponsible, you're being a salesman. If you're actually telling people where the business is going and what the timeline is and what the process is, and core leadership skills are really difficult for people who've always been tactical. And I think it's at this time you have to be even more kind of generous and sort of thoughtful and sort of deliberate around creating clarity for people. And sometimes that means that feels like you're making things up, but really you're just trying to kind of help people shape what's happening more and more. So I think there's a real need to accelerate how much we create clarity. There's a real need for understanding how to just kind of help people through difficult times. Bridging divides is coming up a lot in leadership. There's definitely a big push back towards performance management. It's an interesting tension though, because you have this sort of like, we've got to take care of people more, but we also need to really hold people accountable for results more. And there's sort of this tension between accountability and psychological safety and how companies think about that. That's an interesting conversation that we've been having a lot more. And then I think there's also just a huge awareness of the need to adapt faster than ever. And AI is obviously driving that so much more than anyone was expecting, and so much faster. So there's this real need to adapt and evolve. And so we're seeing a need for growth mindset just accelerate. So we've been practicing and sort of embedding growth mindset in companies for over 10 years now. And there's an explosion of demand for that work right now. So it's kind of, empathy, growth mindset, creating clarity. Those are some of the themes that I'm seeing out there.
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, technology for sure is definitely, at the forefront and on everyone's mind, on not only the fear of how to engage around it, but, how do we use it to leverage the efficiency of our jobs as leaders? Never mind, all the other trends we're seeing around, the great resignation the last couple of years, things like quiet quitting, quiet hiring, all of these things like disinvestments in leadership pipelines, David. We've been talking about this at the summit, right? Just in New York a couple of months ago. And these are all byproducts of what you're seeing in the marketplace, David. In regards to these organizational challenges that are real for all of our listeners today. David, if we continue to ground this for our listeners and our partners here in learning together, I'm wondering if we can, maybe build on this conversation. And as you think about the conversations you're having with, C-suite leaders, and some of the things that leaders need to think about in regards to how people need to be led right now around empathy, building that clarity you talked about. How much do you think leaders need to change in today's current reality?
It's a great question. It's a really great question, because I've been asking this of CEOs recently and CHROs, and it's get all sorts of different responses. I do think there's a core of skills that have always been important, and basically they're just more important now, right? So there's a bunch of things that always mattered, like creating clarity, now just matters much, much more. So if you're even okay at it before, you're sort of failing now, right? And unless you're really, really good at this, people are struggling. So I think the necessity for some of those core skills has really changed. There certainly are some new skills. There are some new things that you need to know how to do, like leading digital transformation, was sort of important before. Now it might be absolutely critical. So I think, when I've polled people, I got sort of interesting numbers. I'd love to poll the audience. If you were to put a percentage on how much leadership, like the act of leading people, needs to change now, what number would you put on it? And then I'll share kind of the number that I've seen. Just put a percentage in the chat. Is it like 1%? Is it 100%? Is it 50%? Is it 25, 75? How much do you think leadership itself needs to change right now? Let's get that in the chat. We've got Alex being first off the mark with 50, 75, 80, 50, 65. Keep them coming. How much do you think leadership needs to change as a percentage? This could have been a fun poll if I thought about it ahead of time, but good to see the numbers coming in. Not many small numbers, right? I think I've seen a couple under 50. There's a 20, there we go. But averaging pretty high. Keep them coming. It's quite a few 80s, 70s, 80s, 90. Thanks, Betsy. So really interesting. Yeah, really interesting. We should get some more data on this and sort of see how it plays out. Thanks very much, everyone. Yeah, whenever you do this kind of survey, often you accidentally end up at 50% because people just sort of, average, right? But it'll depend a little bit on the industry, also the level that we're talking about. But it's a pretty big number. It's a pretty big number that needs to change. And I think the pandemic obviously exacerbated some of the challenges. And I think obviously the hybrid work situation is sort of forcing people to say, well, we this is here to stay now, this different way of working. We're going to have to change how we lead just because of hybrid. Plus, the trauma base that everyone is working from, right? Plus the, AI transformation, plus the divisions in society, sort of, all of this together. I think if it's sort of particular, the hybrid thing, being here to stay, is sort of the most tangible issue. It's having people say we must change leadership, and we must change it quite a bit. I think that's happening more than I've ever seen in 10 years of doing this work. I've never seen so much emphasis on we need to rethink, how leaders lead today.
Yeah, David, also noticed, comment from some of our participants in the chat box, this notion of what's traditionally been called soft skills, right, is behaviors or behaviorally based. And how do we look at the habits and behaviors in the workplace that can really make that impact, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the hard thing, there's that old saying that, soft skills are hard skills. That's the hard thing. And that's the, that's the core of our work, is getting into that messy stuff and making people, making people feel better. So yeah, I think we're going to add some polls at the very end to capture some of these questions more formally. Thanks very much, Evan.
Yeah, David, look, something that I think is on the tip of everyone's tongue is, we're the New Leadership Institute, Dave, and something that we really lean into is both the research and the science. Why don't we talk a little bit about that? Let's pivot to these current realities we're seeing in organizations. And what does the science say about getting this right?
Yeah, look, there's a lot to say about this. We've been studying this question for a long time, and started to really dig in about like between 10 and 15 years ago. But at a meta level, there's sort of an overarching principle that we think is really helpful to follow. It sort of started as a hunch, and we started sort of exploring this idea. And then maybe in the last couple of years, we've said, no, look, this is a really helpful framework. This is our model for organizational change, which really is synonymous with leadership change, because you change organizations by transforming how leaders lead. And if you've been following us for a while, you've heard this before. It's priorities, habits, and systems. You need a really clear set of priorities for people to anchor on. The more people can remember those easily under pressure, the more they change the organization, right? So you need a set of principles to really kind of be your true north. And ideally, what you want with those principles is what we call conscious self-calibration, which is, people thinking about like who to hire or how to run a meeting or how to build a product, and actually holding in mind those principles, comparing them and self-calibrating. So the chunk size of those priorities has to be very small to be able to do that. So we've been doing a lot of that work. And then there's building habits, the way habits actually get built. Really important thing with developing leaders is distinguishing those soft skills as a set of habits and building them the way we digest habits, which is not dissimilar to how we digest food. It's got to be in a certain time, a certain amount of digestion. And then the third thing is systems that support all that. Obviously, if you have great priorities and build habits, but your systems, work the other way, that doesn't help. So it's kind of the combination of priorities, habits, and systems that we think creates both organizational change as well as leadership transformation. And the two are, very, very, very linked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that PHS model has certainly been at the center, or the center cog, if you will, David, in our partnership with clients. And we'll talk about that. I want to ask you some questions about what does that look like in practice, and in just a bit. But I'm curious, David, if we go back to the beginning of that work, when did NLI start doing this kind of work around the PHS model and other science applications, and why? Why was that so important?
Yeah, no, it's. I was reflecting on this, preparing this. Just about everything that we've done that's been meaningful has actually started with a research paper that we published, and those research papers we published, we did without any idea of a commercial application. We just knew there was something to unpack, and one of the things we unpacked 13 years ago, we published it actually now, is essentially the principles for learning to really embed based on the ages model, right? Attention, generation, emotion, and spacing. And then that was in 2010. In 2012, we did an update to that. And the update looked at the real power of social learning and how transformational that was, and the importance of coherence in learning, and a number of other things. And off the back of that, we were essentially studying what leadership development programs looked like through the lens of ages, right, and coherence. And we were studying them, doing a lot of analysis, sort of trying to see patterns. And we just found that most leadership development programs absolutely did not follow the science of learning. In fact, it was amazing how far away they were from the science of learning, right? Most leadership development programs were basically like status rewards, or good opportunities to network, take time off. There were these things, but they were not built around building habits at all, from that perspective. So we looked at it and we started sort of speaking about that lightly, and a bunch of organizations kind of jumped onto it and said, "Oh, can you guys help us and help us to really, really build leaders properly?" And at the time, we didn't have a lot of experience in that, but we've now done this with over 35 organizations, which has been really fascinating. So many learnings, but it really started with anchoring on what are first principles for learning, and then that evolved into what are first principles for designing proper leadership development. And it's been a really interesting journey. The Microsoft case is one of the most one of the most popular ones we talk about, just because we've got permission to mention a lot and we published a lot, but there's 34 others. But we built their model for how to lead and how to develop leaders when Satya started. And it's been central to their whole human capital strategy, the framework we built and the way that leaders are developed. That's all been our work since that time. And they've gone on to tremendous success. I can't say it's all us, of course, but their leaders really do lead differently as a result of the work that we did there, and it's changed the culture.
Yeah, thanks, David. I want to stay in the space of the science a bit more. You've talked about PHS, you've talked about our ages model. If you can talk a little bit more about, the science of sticky, meaningful, coherent, as you think about, leadership models and leadership behaviors and adoption. When we think about changing leadership culture at scale, how does things like stickiness, meaningful, and coherence, as a science perspective, shape organizational context for leaders?
In the end, this stuff is so simple and yet so difficult, right? It's interesting. It's so simple and so kind of difficult all at the same time. Like, the basic fact is, if you have a framework that people just immediately remember, right, and remember this in any situation, like even under pressure, they remember it easily, they'll use it over and over and over. Right? We were just working with a client outside North America on like building one of these frameworks, and we've been working on it for a while, and we did this big intense session. We finally got to something that looked like it might be it, right? And showed it to a couple of executives, and they literally had like goosebumps. They were like, "This is exactly us. This is exactly who we need to be next." And it really, really, it really moved them. And the fascinating thing was, after just seeing it for a minute, they were able to say it without just off memory. And that's the thing. Like, if it's so meaningful, that it literally like gives people an emotional response, right? Then it's absolutely sticking in the brain. It's like you know, because the emotions are really important for memory, right? It's the E in ages. So it's also so coherent, like with everything else they're doing now and where they're going. It's so coherent that it's like a lock in a, you know, putting a key in a lock. It just turns, it stays there, right? Maybe there's a better metaphor, but you know, a puzzle piece in a puzzle that's open, right? One piece just stays there because it's so coherent with everything else. And then, you know, and then there's the simple issue. So it's really hard to do. Like it takes us, and we've done this, I said 35 times, it takes us a few months of working every single week, sort of from the outside down to get these right? Like, you know, it's really complicated. And we've seen many companies try and they get close, but they don't work within the limits of the brain. They end up doing something that people actually can't recall easily under pressure. And if you miss that mark, you actually don't get anywhere near the benefit. So that's one of the easiest, or it's one of the hardest and most important things to do. And one of the easiest things to not do is to get that really, really sticky element, you know, down.
Yeah, that practice, David, really resonates, I think, for a lot of our leaders. It's that notion of getting from really exhaustive, which we're seeing a lot in the systems of organizations, to really essential, right? And I think that sticky, meaningful, coherent, and the PHS model practices help doing so, help organizations to do so. David, I also noticed that we've shared, you mentioned the Microsoft case study. So our team has put that into the chat box. So just for our listeners, have a look in the chat box. We've shared the Microsoft case study for those of you that are interested who want a deeper dive there.
Yeah, that's a deeper one. That page kind of has a lot of different assets on it. I just put in the chat the HBR article on that work as well, which is sort of an easier read if you want to forward that to your CEO or something. That's a nice kind of tight, easy read about that project. But the other link that's there has got, he's even got a webinar with them talking about it and, you know, deeper research and all of that.
Yeah, super helpful. Thanks, David. So David, you know, in the vein of applying the science, you know, we've been doing this work for probably a decade now. What are you noticing now? What's different now in the market in your current conversations with organizations?
Yeah, well, I mean, firstly, there's just the highest ever demand we've seen for transforming leadership. So in the past, it was like, you know, a company would get a new CEO or a new CHRO, right? Or buy another company or divest or something. There's this big change, like this happened with, you know, with Microsoft, with HP, with a number, and then, you know, they'd call us. What we're seeing now is pretty much every company we're talking to is saying, we've got a problem with leadership and we need to do something. The challenge is, are they able and willing to kind of start again? Are they able to just say, look, let's park what we have and really create a greenfield? And often companies are not willing to do that. I think it's a really important thing to do. Leadership development is in some ways like code. Like writing code, right? And sometimes you got this tangled code and everything's messy and you can't fix it. You've got to actually start again and like go right back to the basics of what's the user experience we want, what's the overall architecture we need for this, you know, software product, what's a new foundation we can start on that's really solid, that's going to be, you know, stay solid. You just have to sort of start with new architecture often. And I think leadership development's a lot like that. I also think it's a lot like architecture itself. There's a lot of parallels between what we do and what architects do, right? So architects, you know, get someone's vision and build a blueprint, and then you know, build a building that lasts a long time, right? And a good architect can look at a blueprint and say, wow, that's going to be amazing, or wow, that's going to be absolutely terrible, just from looking at the blueprint, right? If they're really well trained and they've seen a lot of blueprints. And we're like that. We look at a blueprint, which is like a plan for developing leaders. And we can look at it and say, that's going to be amazing. That's really going to build habits, right? It's going to hold together. It's going to stick in people's brains. It's going to change them. Or we'll look at it and go, people are going to have a lot of fun. They're going to tell you they love it. But if you poll them 6 months later, you know, 1 in 10 people will be doing anything at all differently. And that's just not good, right? We know we can get, you know, like 80 or 90% of people doing many things differently, you know, many months after. So it's you know, so that's sort of the way we see it. Is a lot like architecture, and I think it's time that there is more of a science, like architecture has, like a real practice to these things, and we're starting to think about this. So I think so. Firstly, you know, companies are just, you know, more passionate about this. Number one. I think number two, they see the importance of of good architecture because they've had bad architecture for a long time, right? And I think they see the importance of following the science now more than ever. And so, we're busier than ever doing this work and building our team to do even more. And it's really exciting work because we're getting to define the culture you want through the leaders that you want. But yeah, there's a lot we could say. We might do a whole session at some time on the parallels between kind of culture change work and architecture, because it really is very, very similar in many, many different domains.
Yeah, that'd be a really interesting conversation.
I'm just seeing a comment there. I'm going to change platforms. I've had this problem a couple of times. I'm going to change platforms. So just if I'm not here, I'll be back in about 15 seconds. Give me a second.
Yeah, no worries, David. I'll continue with the audience as you shift networks there, just because we're noticing there's a delay in your connection there. So folks, as we continue to build on the conversation that David's talking about here, something that we're seeing in the chat box here is this idea of shifting on soft skills, right? It's been an issue for a long time in organizations. And so what David's talking about is how do we embed a lot of these constructs or models for leadership in creating simplicity in them so that they have meaningful leaders and they can recall them in meaningful ways. David, I want to continue this conversation about, how we change leaders in organizations. The question I have for you is how long does this process actually take? I mean, what are you seeing currently given, the complexity in organizations, but really being, explicitly putting in processes for shifting and changing leaders? How long does that take?
It's an interesting question. I think that you can do a lot in the first year. We've seen huge change in a year, which has been amazing, particularly doing it differently. The classic way of we're going to take the top people, put them in a business school, week-long program or something, and then, slowly then cascade down. This takes years and years, and you never actually get the momentum to really change the culture, we believe. But we've seen you can do a lot in 1 year from a standing start, from sort of having a really messy, noisy framework to a beautiful blueprint. Takes about 3 months, about another 3 months to really design and prepare a habit activation strategy. And in about 6 months, you can scale that habit activation strategy to pretty much any scale. We've done, 50,000, done 100,000. Really powerful leadership development to that size audience, to 1,000 managers or 10,000 managers, for example. So you can actually do a lot in a year. Now, then you got to look at, so how do you continue that, and also how do you get into the systems? The systems work takes longer, right? So you'll do this transformation, and you'll get people much more focused on, say, growth mindset and psych safety, which are two really big recurring themes. But then you'll go, okay, well, we need to change performance management because that's working against both growth mindset and psych safety. Oh, and we need to change, how we promote people. That's also going against those things. And we also need to change just, how people learn. And so all that's a good process. But you can do very meaningful work in 1 year from a standing start at any size, which has been amazing to work that out. But really it's a 2 to 4 year journey. And I also think it's a constant journey. It's a bit like, how long does it take to get and stay fit? The answer is you can get fit pretty quickly, but the staying fit is ongoing. There is no answer to how long does it take to stay fit. The answer is all your life, right? How long does it take to keep great leaders? The answer is it's a continual process in many, many ways. So, it's very much ongoing.
Yeah, that word consistency is showing up for me here, David, in this conversation. When we think about that PHS model you talked about earlier, David, that's really that central cog that drives that consistency. I'm wondering, what is that balance between priorities versus habits and systems that you're seeing with organizations that really is that sweet spot? And I guess it depends, but that's my question for you.
Yeah, we'll always come back to the biological perspective on this kind of thing, right? And you can actually develop measures and test these things pretty cleanly. But what basically companies do is most of the time they build just a set of priorities. They don't do the habits work, and they lightly do the systems work. And when they build the set of priorities, they're much too exhaustive. You can't put it on one page and really make sense of it at a glance. You can't see how everything fits together. So it's we think of sort of a one pager as like a blueprint where you can see the vision and the strategy and the leadership, expectations and the values and whatever else is important. You can see it all in one page, and you can see how they tie together. They actually fit together. They make sense, and you can digest each part and be pulled in, right? It's got high fluency. So that work, is really important. It doesn't take that long, but we just see organizations just being way too complicated, and it's way too much in there. They're just not respecting the limitations of how we can understand new ideas and how we can recall them, right? So that's important. The most important piece, though, is really the habits work, and think of, it might sound fast, 6 months, but you won't believe what we can do in 6 months with 3 months building. There's an incredible amount you can do if you're leveraging technology and leveraging managers as the delivery mechanisms as well. Trying to get people into classrooms. You're doing manager-led learning in really powerful ways that can scale fast. So I think it's a little bit on priorities, really making sure that blueprint is right. You want to show multiple architects and all of them sign off and say, hey, this building's going to hold up. This building's going to be beautiful. This building's going to call people into it. But you can do that pretty quickly. The habits work, really, really important to get right. Much harder to do without really, really understanding it. I mean, we're at version, I don't know, 50 or something of designing habits, of habit activation strategies. And I look back on some of our first work in this space, and we've learned so much, evolved so much to get much more efficient. I think that's the really hard nut to crack on your own.
Yeah, David, the habits, activating those habits in organizational constructs, it can be tricky too. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the systems of the PHS model that we're seeing. There's a default that we depend on the old systems in our organizations or processes to activate the new habits you're talking about, and that doesn't work, right?
I mean, I think we just talked about that. It's performance and promotion and assessment and development, like all the talent systems, the people systems need to just be in line with the foundational principles of how you're developing leaders. So, accountability, psychological safety, and growth mindset are 3 principles that we see coming up over and over and over. And there's some interesting tensions between them and dynamics. You actually can have all 3. Like accountability and psych safety means being really, really clear about outcomes and then creating a lot of safety and motivation to go after them. You actually need both, right? You need to be disciplined about outcomes, but then encouraging and supportive on the other side. Not, so there's ways these mold together. But I think it's taking these principles like accountability, psych, safety, growth mindset, and saying, all right, let's look at our systems through those lenses. And see what we see. We actually have a kind of a product in a sense that analyzes your whole talent practice against these, and it's kind of a coherence analysis. So we can look at your hiring and promotion and feedback and performance systems, everything, and say, look, this is how well it aligns with, say, growth mindset. This is where there might be bias in there accidentally. This is where it might be upsetting people accidentally. All these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, David. I think that gives us all and our listeners a solid baseline for what underpins, as a science that drives our practice. Why don't we pivot there, David, into the practice? Let's talk about the practical. Why don't you walk us through some of the examples that you're able to talk about with our clients? Some client examples of where this best practice has shown up with real impact.
Yeah, it's interesting. If I showed you 35 different strategies or different company strategies, right, for developing leaders, you'd be like, wow, they're all so different. They're so different. And part of the reason for that is that we bring first principles in science, and then we really partner with an organization to understand what their capabilities are, what capabilities they want to build, what their resources are in terms of, facilitation, instructional design, all this stuff. And we find the optimal model. And honestly, there's a continuum from one end of the continuum. It's like, we'll just license everything and do train the trainer, and you do everything. The other end of the continuum is we'll build everything, deliver everything, manage everything, measure everything, everything. And we're pretty agnostic about where, the partnership should be. But we want to leverage the organization's assets and resources and resources they want to build. Quite often people will hire, based on partnering with us, a few specific people to really, drive a change. So they all look different. To be honest, but then there's a similarity that you see. And if you were to look at, look at the blueprint, you'd see just the chunk size of everything's really clean and consistent. There's high fluency. in everything. So you feel compelled to kind of keep reading, to keep, engaging, right? There's no like, oh, what does that even mean? Things are really clear. And so at every step in the learning journey, we're, creating clarity. So you'll see just a lot more clarity than often, a lot more coherence as well. So things fitting together. And then you'll just see, we're just following the science of learning. We're following ages in a lot of ways. So you'll see we don't do one-off events. Like the smallest learning experience we have is 30 days, right? Because as someone's saying, attending training doesn't change behavior. That's because training is not it is a one-off experience. Sometimes the follow-up. A habit activation strategy is not training. A habit activation strategy is actually about it's much closer to coaching, if anything. A habit activation strategy is much closer to kind of group coaching, but very different at the same time. But it's over time. It's little bites and then apply it, little bites and then apply it, right? It's in a social context, and it's very insight rich. So those principles are consistent, right? Things are the experience is insight rich. It's over time. It's little bites and apply it. There's a lot of positive pressure involved. But then when you look at the journeys, you're like, wow, there's a lot of different ways of building this from those principles, and there really, really are. But one of the things that's really important is, what are the habits you're trying to build? Going and building them the way habits get built, right? And then measuring afterwards how much they actually have been built. And I think that's really important. We just did some fantastic work with Avanade, that 50,000 person organization, and they're a technology company in a partnership between Microsoft and Accenture. And we went back and studied some of the impacts of the work. And one of the principles was create the future, like really expand your thinking, experiment courageously, like they're in the AI space directly. So what we found was like 88% of people were now encouraging others to share new thinking every week. Like this is a weekly thing. 91% were making a bigger effort to work across teams. So pretty much everyone. So we really created this collaboration environment. And 94% were experimenting with completely new approaches at work. So really big numbers. Now, no one attended in-person training with this experience. This was a very digital experience. But yet it followed the principles that we found so important, and then scaled to 50,000, right? So I can't say, look, there's this one exact way to do it that works in every organization. I can say there are principles, and then there's sort of a way that sort of works with you.
Mm-hmm. David, those are certainly some profound data points for impact and value in the application of PHS. But what are some of the traps potentially, David, that you see that companies fall into around priorities, habits, and systems applications?
Yeah, no, I think we talked about that a little bit already. I think just not respecting habits, not respecting the way habits need to be built. So you end up building more of kind of a marketing campaign, not a habit activation strategy. And this is one of those areas where some of our experts can look at that blueprint, that learning blueprint, and say, no, that's a marketing campaign. That's a priorities embedding campaign, not a habit activation strategy. That's the biggest mistake I see, right? And we know what a habit activation strategy looks like, and the basics of it is you sort of imagine people going through this. How many times a week would they be resonating with the ideas that they learned, like a month later, like a month after experiencing that initiative, whether it was a month-long initiative or a year-long initiative, a month after that, how much would people really be resonating still with the ideas? And we've actually gone back to many programs built by others and done the measurement piece. And we've asked people like a month later, hey, how many different ideas do you remember from the program? And how many different ideas are you applying now every week? Like at least once a week, you're applying a new idea. And it's frightening how low those numbers are in most solutions. And whereas, for us, a total failure would be like 60% of people applying a habit every week. That's terrible for us. Like, 75 is kind of okay. Our target's 80 to 95% of a large audience applying specific habits every week. So it's really about thinking about habit activation strategies. And, Betsy asking, is there an example? One of them is you take a large audience of leaders, let's say 1,000 leaders, 10,000 person company, and you give them a little bit of content every week for them to share with their team. So, week 1, content about one specific principle, right? Like maybe create clarity, right? And the leaders themselves have to actually share this with their teams, talk about it, and everyone work on it for that week, right? The next week they come back, debrief on what they did, introduce a next habit, maybe generate energy. What does this mean for us? And so, doing that with a short video and then simple guides, doing that over a few weeks, what happens is it really gets into the water that people are drinking very, very, very powerfully. In fact, more powerfully than putting people in-person training, and way more scalably, because you can just send this to people, and provided you create the supports, it really works. So we've seen tremendous impact with a habit activation strategy that way. But we're also doing some new experiments, which we can talk about in a minute, of sort of some different ways of doing this as well.
Yeah, really great, David. I've heard you say over and over and over, this notion of one habit at a time across the whole organization is really powerful, right? At scale. David, let's talk about big leadership retreats in the context of our conversation here today. What about big leadership retreats run by businesses, like business schools? What are some of the strengths and challenges you're seeing in what they're trying to do and achieve there for leaders?
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of classically how people think of leadership development, right? And you've got the business schools doing them. You've got, Center for Creative Leadership doing great work in that space. You've got, lots of people in that space. We're not deep in that space. We used to do it a bit. We sort of took a break from it. We're coming back to it now, but in a certain way. They're seen as sort of like, that's the only way you can do leadership development. We just completely disagree. They have a certain value, and they do. They do give people a sense of status, a sense like it's a reward for people. And one of the most important things you get out of this is building relationship between the participants. And it is true that spending, a couple of days with people somewhere else and, really digging deep and having meals together and, sharing time with this, you really do build relationships more than you will, in something that's digital. There's no question. The challenge is you really don't build habits very well. And so I think, one of the ideal strategies is kind of hybrid learning, right? Like, let's spend a little time together. Maybe let's split that up if we can, all right? Maybe if we can't, we'll do a smaller block, right? Don't do 4 or 5 days, do a day and a half or 2 days, So, let's do that. And then let's do the real work, the way real work gets done, which is, interacting with people every week in some digital form. So that's, so I think it's just important to respect the upsides of these retreats. There are real upsides, right? Building relationship, having the deeper strategic conversations, building connections. Just don't try to imagine you're building deep habits. You can do some really deep work with people. You really can open their minds and change them, but it's really important then to come back. And the best way to come back, honestly, is take the people that you've put in the retreat and give them tools to change everyone else. Right? If you've got 20 leaders 20 C-suite leaders in a retreat, spend some of the time in that retreat preparing them for how they're going to teach these ideas to their teams, which is now 200, right? And preparing those people to impact their teams, which is now 2,000. Mm-hmm. So there's definitely upsides to being together. I won't, I said we've started to do them as well. But here's the downside of them, right? You've got 10,000 employees, 1,000 people managers, 100 top leaders and 10 C-suite, right? What happens is you invest heavily in the 10 C-suite, you invest a little bit in the 100, but then you run out of budget and steam and time to get to the 1,000 managers. And what happens is you spend a lot of time and money and resources on the top 100, hoping it will trickle down. We just don't believe that it does. And it's so slow as well. So we'd rather invest like something in the top 1,000 and you use the top 100 to really power that up, but really think about the top 1,000 managers in a 10,000 person company and really build something that scales. So I guess it's this question. If you've got 10 people, what's the best thing to do? Take them on a retreat. Absolutely. You've got 10,000 people. What's the best thing to do? Don't take 10 people on a retreat. Build something for 1,000 managers, right? And brief those 10 to really power that up. So it's just sort of depends what question you're asking. So those retreats are really helpful, but they don't really change the company. So we're interested in changing the company in that way.
Yeah, changing a company at scale is certainly critical, David. But what we see is the default from organizations in depending on and building large-scale libraries of learning, where they think that is the solution for solving for the leadership gaps and skill sets. Why isn't that doing the job, David?
Yeah, I mean, look, Skillsoft and LinkedIn Learning and Harvard Managed Mentor have done a fantastic job of building these awesome libraries, and it's not changed the quality of leadership one bit, as far as I can tell. The challenge with these libraries, they're awesome for people who kind of know that they have a gap they want to learn. The challenge with these libraries is there's a couple of things. One is the more people really need the skills, the less they use the platforms, right? The less people need the skills, the more they use the platforms. So there's a real challenge in that. But the second thing is, you put 100 people through one of these platforms, they learn 100 different models for how to lead from 100 different thought leaders, and everything's very tangly. There's no like, oh, here's how we give feedback here, here's how we set goals here, here's how we like deal with challenges here, right? So unless you have kind of your own leadership framework and really build habits around that, you end up with 100 different ways of doing everything with these platforms. So technical skills are solved beautifully by just looking up YouTube or looking up one of these platforms and saying, hey, how do I fix this widget? Because people know they have the gap, and they'll feel better when they have the answer. But soft skills have a long history of not being budged at scale, right, on platforms. So of course there are individuals who get some benefit here and there. But if you're talking about 10,000 employees, 1,000 managers, give 1,000 managers access to this platform. It'll look cheap, right? You won't spend much money, but actually check the data, like dig into the data, like 3 months in, find out how many hours people spent. Ask them how many habits they built. Ask them like specifically what habits did they apply, and you'll see some really scary data in that result. If you need any help with that, we'll help you design a measurement strategy.
Yeah, David, this is the perfect segue for our conversation. I know here internally at NLI, we're about to launch a brand new approach to leadership development that we've been working on for some months. Maybe you can tell the audience a little bit about it. Like, where did this idea come from around launching a new leadership development approach and framework?
Yeah, no, for sure. And just to respond to a question from LinkedIn as well about social learning, we've been looking at obviously the digital transformation of learning for a long time, and we've to be honest, we've stayed on the sidelines. And the reason we've stayed on the sidelines and not kind of built some platform or an app or something like that, the reason we haven't is that we didn't believe the technology was there yet to deliver the absolutely necessary conditions for habit activation at scale. Right now, so again, there's a difference between training and habit activation, right? So we didn't believe that the technology was there for habit activation at scale. Now, what are the principles? The first one is learning over time, so one habit at a time. And you could say, well, the platforms can enable that. That's true, they do, right? The second principle is really insight-driven learning. So you're creating insights. Most of the platforms don't really do that. They're just about driving content, not generating insight. And so you have to think a whole different way when your goal is people having these big aha moments, right? It's not about, feeding content, feeding information. You actually have to think really differently. You almost got to think like someone who's writing stand-up comedy. Like, how do you get this moment where the audience suddenly gets it, right? So designing for insight was bad in technology. And the third one was actually social. All these platforms have a degree of social engagement, but they're sort of flat and one-dimensional, just people commenting on different things, and people don't really use them that much. That was sort of the biggest gap that we saw in technology. So what happened was we started to get a bit more serious about a year ago about, has the technology caught up? And we actually found a technology company out there who'd been a little bit influenced by our research, who'd been building for a long time. And we dug deep into what they had. And what we found was that we could massively customize this platform and actually build on top of it. And we started some time ago, and we did a test. We got some incredible results, like 90% of people engaging straight away, multiple times, like really staying engaged. And so we started to challenge ourselves and say, look, is there a sort of foundational set of habits that's relevant to most organizations and to most managers, right? You can't say like all the way to C-suite necessarily, but most organizations, you got first-time managers, middle managers, senior managers. That's like out of the 1,000, that's like 900, right? So out of 1,000 managers, 900 of them actually could learn really consistent habits and maybe just have different stories and scenarios. But we found like 90% of managers in an organization actually you can address with one framework. And then maybe you can add some modules and elements for the other 100. for the other 10%. So we said, is there something that works for 90%, that works for most organizations, that has the critical habits, right, that people need? And honestly, we argued more fiercely than anything we've ever done at Innerline. You were part of that, Matt. We argued over and over and over about the architecture at the top. We debated long and hard, is the first set of habits about yourself, or do we jump straight into dealing with others? That was a big debate, really thinking deeply about that. And then the question for us is, if you're focused on yourself, what 3 things matter most, right? If you focus on others, what 3 things matter most? And if you focus on results and outcomes, what 3 things matter most? It took a long time, and I didn't know if we could do it. In the end, we were able to come up with a framework, which is, manage yourself, mobilize others, drive results, as kind of 3 chapters. And we found there was a consistent set of insights based on growth mindset, psych safety, and accountability. We found there was a consistent set of insights and actions and habits that could be put together. So, you'll hear more about this. We're not officially launching it yet. There's going to be a website up straight after Thanksgiving, which will actually give you the ability to go in and register. And for the first time in our history, we're actually making our programs available to the public, our leadership program. So there's going to be an open enrollment version of this experience starting in the first quarter 2024, so January to March. So you'll see that coming up just after Thanksgiving. We're calling the solution LEAD. It's not an acronym. It's just, we like simple statements like grow and lead and decide. But we're calling the solution LEAD, and it's essentially a 6-month journey. You could do it in 3 months if you want to rush, but it's a 6-month journey, 15 minutes a week, building the foundational insights for leading. So manage yourself, mobilize others, drive results are the 3 overall categories. And within those, we've identified 9 critical habits. So just put the word lead in the chat if you're interested in getting an early notice about that. We'll make sure that we follow up with you and send you the link to the webpage. And this is something available to individuals to go through with a cohort as well. There's a cohort coach for each one. There's AI involved. There's all sorts of things. So you'll see that. Oh, wow, lots of interest. So the platform itself, we're actually going to shift all of our solutions to be available on. And of course, we're calling it a habit activation platform because it's literally a platform for activating habits. So we've had for a long time Hives, which is high impact virtual experiences on Zooms. We've had distributed learning solutions, which are very scalable. Now we're going to have HAPS, habit activation platforms. And so in the first quarter, we'll have LEAD, which is a 6-month journey, but we'll also have growth mindset available as a 1-month journey. So we'll have growth mindset and then our other solutions. So a habit activation platform is the official title of that. And we're really excited about that. So, is that all you should do in leadership development? No, but this can provide a base. And then if you're, if you've got the budget and the time, maybe bring people together for a habit activation lab for a day at the end of module 1, right? At the end of Manage Yourself, let's bring people together for a day. If you've got the time and budget to really deepen that, let's bring them together at the end of Mobilize Others for a day. And then let's bring them together at the end of, Drive Results for a day or even 2 days. And so you can add things. You can add one-to-one coaching. One of our best kept secrets is we've trained 25,000 coaches. And so there's one-to-one coaching we can add and all sorts of things. So we're excited about that. It's our biggest transformation in probably in 25 years. And we wouldn't have done this if we didn't think we could get the results that were much better than just in-person learning. But we're really confident from our early studies that we can deliver much more effective learning than doing leadership retreats in person at much, much less cost and much faster and much scalably. So now if you've got 900 leaders or 9,000 leaders everywhere in the world in every language, they can actually all learn to be better leaders, based on how the brain works. So, lots of interest in that. Thanks for everyone who's interested. We'll get that out to you. And I'm excited to be able to offer this to individual practitioners as well to really get in and learn the research. So that's what's coming. We think there is still value in leadership retreats. There's value also in a number of different things, but I think LEAD can give the basics of LEAD can give the basics on on what's happening here. So back to you, Matt. I think we probably should close in a minute or two.
Yeah, absolutely. David, thank you for such a rich dialogue in this space of reimagining leadership. And thank you for sharing not only the science, but the practice in such a tangible way. I think that really resonated, as we can see from our listeners.
David, just remembered, sorry, one announcement. I just realized we are running a mini summit. Maybe Evan can put in the chat a link or the date to that. We're actually running a mini summit just on this idea, which is a half day coming up in December. So we'll let people know who are interested in that. But maybe if there's a link, put that in, or the date as well there. Sorry, Matt, back to you.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, David. Important information. Drew, we'll hand it back over to you for some announcements as we wrap up the session today. Thanks, Drew.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. Great conversation. Thanks, everyone behind the scenes. And Drew, appreciate your ongoing partnership. Thanks, everyone. Take care of yourselves. We'll see you in the next few weeks. Have a great Thanksgiving as well.
Excellent. Thank you, David. And thank you, Matt. So great discussion today. Lots of great insights around leadership development, improvement, and really around habits can help transform organizations at scale. And secondly, a lot of strong engagement from all of you in the audience. So hoping you all found value in today's session as well. So now for my favorite part here is it's time for our research corner. And this is a polling time. So we want to continue partnering with our research team here at NLI. And we want to gain some insights from you all, which is super important for us and how it informs the next iterations of our existing programs, as well as what we're putting out in the space. So this season, we're looking to gather some data to help inform solutions in their development. We'd like to just give you a few minutes to fill out this poll. So go ahead. It's visible right now. Excellent. And this really helps inform how NLI can help you all in the future as well. We'll keep this poll up for a few more minutes, but we do want to thank you for attending today, staying engaged, sharing your questions, your thoughts, your insights, your Q&As. We couldn't have had these conversations without you all. You've been a great audience. Definitely check out our season pass, where you can sign up in advance for all the episodes, so you get access to all of that. In addition, we have our summit, which we hosted back on October 4th and 5th in 2023. And if you weren't able to join us there in person and or virtually, you're in luck. We have access to buy on-demand passes, so you can dive into the panels, the conversations that define such an amazing and incredible experience for all of this year. Great being back in person and great mingling with a lot of you all here in the audience today. Our team's going to drop that link into the chat as well. And just a little more conversation around the mini summit. David brought this up at the end, and Evan's going to be dropping this into the chat if he hasn't already done so. This is going to be on the topic of leadership. So mark your calendars, December 13th. We're going to all come together, discuss a variety of topics around leadership, as well as with some great guests. So team's going to, again, share the registration link there. And just in terms of us here at NLI, we are officially saying farewell to this Friday. On behalf of today's guests, the NLI team behind the scenes, which is phenomenal and really helps prop us up, and Evan and Tony and the rest of the team there. Thanks again for joining us. We will not be going live next Friday. We are observing the Thanksgiving holiday, and we hope you all are too. Or maybe you're doing some Black Friday shopping. I'm not sure. But we hope you have a wonderful holiday, and it was great to be here with you today. Thanks so much, and great to be here, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.